Chapter 20. The Shepherd Writes a Letter. To purchase the sheep and the ranch in the hollow, Mr. Matthews had placed a heavy mortgage on not only upon the ranch land, but upon the homestead as well. In the loss of his stock, the woodsman would lose all he had won in years of toil from the mountain wilderness. When the total failure of the crops became a certainty, and it was clear that the country could not produce enough feed to carry his flock through the winter until the spring grass, Mr. Matthews went to the settlement hoping to get help from the bank there where he was known. He found the little town in confusion, and the doors of the bank closed. The night before, a band of men had entered the building and forced the safe, and escaped to the mountains with their booty. Old Matt's interview with the bank official was brief.
"It's simply impossible, Mr. Matthews," said the man. "As it is, we shall do well to keep our own heads above water."
Then the mountaineer had come the long way home. As he rode slowly up the last hill, the giant form stooped with a weariness unusual, and the rugged face looked so worn and hopelessly sad that Aunt Molly, who was waiting at the gate, didn't need words to tell him of his failure. The old man got stiffly from his saddle, and when he had removed saddle and bridle and had turned the animal into the lot, the two walked into the house. But they didn't enter the building. Without a word, they turned aside from the steps and followed the little path to the graves in the rude enclosure beneath the pines, where the sunshine fell only in patches here and there. That night after supper, Mr. Matthews went down into the hollow to see the shepherd.
"It's going to be mighty hard on Molly and me leaving the old place up yonder,"
said the big man when he had told of his unsuccessful trip.
"It won't matter so much to the boy 'cause he's young yet, but we worked hard, Mr. Howitt, for that home. Molly and me has, we sure have. She's up there now, sitting on the porch and a-living it all over again, like she does when there's no one around, with her face turned towards them pines west of the house. It's mighty nigh breaking her heart just to think of leaving, but she'll hide it all from me when I go up there, thinking not to worry me, as if I don't know. And it's going to be mighty hard to part with you too, Mr. Howitt. I don't reckon you'll ever know, sir, how much you done for us. For me, most of all."
The shepherd made as if to interrupt, but the big man continued.
"Don't you suppose we can see, sir, how you've made over the whole neighborhood? There ain't a family for 10 miles that don't come to you when they're in trouble. And then there's Sammy Lane a-reading and a-talking, just about the same as you do yourself, fit to hold up her end with anyone who's got education. And Jim himself's changed something wonderful. Same old Jim in lots of ways, but something more. Somehow, though, I can't tell it. And then there's my boy Grant. I know right well what he'd have been if it weren't for you, to show him what the best kind of man's like. He'd have sure never knowed it from me. I don't mean as if he'd ever been a bad man like Wash Gibbs, but a no-account one like them Thompsons, but he could have never been what he is now, through and through, if it hadn't been for you. There's a heap more, too, all over the country you've been talking at Sunday, when the persons ain't there, and as for me, you sure been a God's blessing to me and Molly, Mr. Howitt."
Again the shepherd moved uneasily, as if to protest, but his big friend made a gesture of silence.
"Please, let me say it while I got a chance, Dad."
And the other bowed his head, while old Matt continued.
"I can't tell how it is, and I don't reckon you'll understand anyway, but staying as you have after our talk that first night you come, and living down here on this spot alone after you knowed it's It's just like I was a little kid and you was standing big and strong, like between me and the big blackness that was something awful. I reckon it looks kind of foolish me talking this way. Maybe I'm just getting old, but anyhow, I just wanted you to know.
The shepherd raised his head, and his face was aglow with a glad, triumphant light, while his deep voice was full of meaning as he said gently,
It's been more to me, too, than you think, Mr. Matthews. I ought to tell you. I will tell you.
He checked himself and added,
I'll tell you someday.
and then he changed the topic quickly.
Are you sure there's no one who can help you over this hard time? Is there no way at all?
The mountaineer shook his head.
I've gone over it all over again and again. Williams at the bank is the only man I know who had the money. He's done for now by this robbery. You see, I can't go to strangers, Dad. I ain't got nothing left for security.
But could you not sell the sheep for enough to save the homestead?
Who would buy? Who could buy, if they could, in this country without a bit of feed? And then look at 'em. They're so poor and weak now they couldn't stand the driving to the shipping place. Gosh, they just die all over the road. They're just skin and bones, Daddy. Ain't no butcher would pay freight on 'em even.
Mr. Howard sat with knit brows, staring into the shadows, and then he said slowly, Well, there is that old mine. If this man Dewey was only here, do you suppose? Again the mountaineer shook his head.
Colonel Dewey would be a mighty old man now, Dad, even if he was living. 'Tain't likely he'll ever come back, nor 'tain't likely the mine will ever be found without him. I studied all that on the way home.
As he finished speaking, he rose to go, and the dog, springing up, dashed out the cabin and across the clearing towards the bluff by the corral, barking furiously. The two men looked at each other. A rabbit, said Mr. Howard, but they both knew that the well-trained shepherd dog never tracked a rabbit, and old Matt's face was white when he mounted to ride up the trail. Long the shepherd stood in the doorway, looking out into the night, listening to the voices of the wilderness. In his life in the hills he found a little brightness, while in the old mountaineer's words that evening he had glimpsed a future happiness of which he had scarcely dared to dream. With the single exception of that one wild night, his life had been an unbroken calm. Now he was to leave it all. And for what? He seemed to hear the rush and the roar of the world beyond the ridges, as one in a quiet harbor hears outside the thunder of a stormy sea, and he shuddered. The gloom and the mystery of it all crept into his heart. He was so alone, but it was not the wilderness that made him shudder. It was the thought of the great, mad, cruel world that raged beyond those hills, and then something else. The dog growled again, facing threateningly towards the cliff. What is it, Brave? The only answer was an uneasy whine as the animal crouched closer to the man's feet. The shepherd peered into the darkness in the direction of the ruined cabin. God, how can I leave this place? He whispered. He turned back into the house, closed and barred the door, with the manner of one making a resolution against a hard struggle. He took writing material from the top shelf of the cupboard and seated himself at the table and began to write. The hours slipped by, and page after page, closely written, came from the shepherd's pen, while, as he wrote, the man's face grew worn and haggard. It was as though he lifted again the burden he'd learned to lay aside. At last it was finished, and placing the sheets in an envelope, he wrote the address with a trembling hand. While Mr. Howard was writing his letter at the ranch, and old Matt was tossing sleeplessly on his bed in the big log house, a horseman rode slowly down from the Compton Ridge Road. Stopping at the creek to water, he pushed on up the mountain towards the Lane cabin. The horse walked with a low-hung head and lagging feet. The man slouched, half asleep in the saddle. It was Jim Lane. End of chapter 20.